it's not just that we should never impose multiculturalism on other countries. It's that we actively don't in many respects, and that we say that they are colonized peoples, therefore they have a right to self-determination. Or, for example, Israel being a great example. Nobody in their right mind, at least, there are lots of pro-Palestinian activists who would, but nobody in their right mind would turn around and say, okay, Israel has enemies on its border, and therefore it should dilute its religious and ethnic composition and weaken its defenses in the face of surrounding enemies. Yet we do take that approach to us because we expect to be the parameters in which universal liberal cosmopolitanism can exist, so long as we just import anyone from everywhere to these shores, and as soon as they make contact with the soil or secular capitalism, they're going to be transmogrified into just as productive as you or I. And I do think this is something that Eric has written about in White Shift. The immigration concerns that are being expressed in this election by Reform, even though Reform themselves are sort of dipping into the "we're not racist, we promise" messaging now, they shouldn't just be couched in logistical terms. It shouldn't just be the fact that there's more demand on housing and more demand on the trains and all these things which might affect fertility rates, but as I'm sure you'll contest, aren't the leading drivers. It's that actually, if we recognize there are ethnic saliences in other peoples, that people tell themselves a sort of story, that lots of people with these cultural and historical memories, they won't map onto this liberal cosmopolitanism because they themselves are not saying, why can't we just put ethnicity one side and all get along? Then why can't we have that same concern of ourselves? We say, actually, we are okay to have the native host population remain the native host population. We're okay to have their culture be preserved. And it's not actually violent or prejudicial to want to do so. It's strange that there's a complete block there, and that any time you say, we want to get the birth rate up among the native population who say they want their own birth rate up, that's just immediately demonized as far right. I mean, there's the thing. Do you have a theory on why that's the case?
Well, for that, you'd need a theory of wokeness, which I think Eric's coming out with a book the same day as I am, and a theory of why there's something particular and peculiar within, what do you want to call it, Western society, Western liberalism, that can, at the extreme, turn to a form of self-hatred. It's very difficult to excavate that and understand why that is. And I'm looking forward to reading Eric's book and understanding it perhaps a little bit better. But first of all, I've never suggested that we have, and I wouldn't support for a moment any kind of ethnically preferential prenatalism. So every British couple, every British woman, every British man should be supported to have more children in the same way. Now, where has that not been the case? I can think of 3 cases since the war of countries that I know of that have adopted ethnically selective pronatalism. Not Israel, by the way, which used to give medals to mothers. And back in the 50s, 60s, Ben Gurion was mostly giving them to Arab mothers because they were the ones who had the biggest families. And he said, we can't possibly discriminate. No, where were they? One was the Soviet Union, which introduced new pronatal policies in the 80s, late 70s, and said, we're going to roll these out across the country, but we'll start in the Slavonic heartland. And it never got down to the Caucasus, and it never got down where they were actually having large families, or Central Asia. A second was Romania, where Ceausescu said no contraception, no abortion, but sort of turned the other cheek, or cast a blind eye for the Hungarians. Wouldn't let Romanians out of the country, but was happy to see Jews and Germans leave. The third is China, which today is engaged in encouraging fertility rates in some parts of the country, ethnically, not others. Now, what have all these 3 places got in common? They're all communists. So the communists, who are the first to jump on their high horse and to condemn anyone suggesting for a moment that you might have ethnically preferential pronatal policies, are the only ones I know of since the war who've engaged in them. Anyway, I'm not suggesting those for a moment. And it's very interesting, in the last census, as I said, ethnic minorities in this country do not have higher fertility rates on the whole. If they do, they don't last very long. Within a generation or 2, they're gone. And the only ethnic minority in this country which declined at the last census was the Afro-Caribbean one, because they have a very low fertility rate. And there's also a lot of intermarriage, and so people probably recategorize themselves, having been Afro-Caribbean, to mixed race or whatever. So I don't for a moment suggest we should ever have prenatal policies that are, I mean, within our constitutional setup, it's inconceivable to do what the communists have done. So I wouldn't suggest that for a moment. But it does remind me, actually, a very good friend of mine was a theorist of nationalism called Anthony Smith. He was a professor at the LSE. And he was actually Eric's PhD supervisor. And I knew Anthony long before I knew Eric. And Anthony wrote a lot about theories of nationalism. And he was a very cosmopolitan, centrist, sensible child of Jewish refugees from Germany. And yet he always talked, without any apology in his time, about what he would call the myth of common ancestry. Now, myth, not in the sense that it's not true or it is true, but simply the idea that people tell themselves a story of having a family link. They may not be first cousins or second cousins of everybody in the country, but somehow, somewhere, they are tied by a common ancestry. And that story of common ancestry is important in a national story, whether it is genetically true or not. And of course, since Anthony's day, he died in 2016, but since his last years and subsequently, genetic work on genetics tells us an awful lot more than we ever thought we could know about people's actual ethnic origin. And I don't see that it's terribly wrong for a people to say we are have varied ancestry. We have people who've come from all over the world, but the majority population is indeed descended from a common group of people. Now, in this case of this country, England, we thought it was the Anglo-Saxons, and there are really interesting debates about how many Anglo-Saxons came, to what extent they intermarried with the local Britons. Were the Britons really Celts? Did they all go off to Ireland? Really interesting questions. But at the heart of it is the sense of a nation being a continuity with adjuncts, with people coming along, like my own parents being immigrants, and joining the wider story, aligning to that story emotionally and politically, but the core of the country being a set of people who do have what Anthony Smith would have called a myth of common ancestry. I'm not even sure you can talk about that nowadays, or, well, here we are talking about it, and the police aren't about to burst in. But I think it's perfectly, if you go to Korea or Japan, that's so obvious.
It's not even questioned.
No, they wouldn't even think about it. And as I've said elsewhere, we're now at the point where in East Asia, it's so obvious, nobody would dream of talking about it. And in Europe, we're not even sure we can talk about it.
Thank you for watching that clip from Tomlinson Talks. If you liked that and you would like to see more, you can get the full 90-minute show every week on a Wednesday afternoon, live from 3 p.m, only on lotuseaters.com, and all of the other content that my colleagues produce behind the paywall for as little as £5 a month. Thank you very much for supporting us, and I hope to see you there. Until next time, goodbye.